The storm came in low and bitter, a crawling thing of sleet and wind that scraped its claws across the high desert basin like it meant to scour the world clean. The town of Mercy Creek, just a splinter of light and timber tucked in the crook of two mesas, braced against it with shuttered windows and shivering livestock. Smoke curled like ghosts from chimneys. Folks stayed close to hearths and prayer, waiting for the cold to pass and spring to mean what it used to. He came in from the hills late that evening, saddle stiff beneath him, coat stiff with ice at the edges. Eli Cade, once a name known too well in these parts, now just another man with a past that traveled behind him like a broken wagon wheel. He'd built a life out of quiet things since the war, mending fences, raising colts, saying little. The land didn't ask questions. It took what it was given and gave back only in seasons and silence. He wasn't looking for anything that night. Just hay for the mule, beans in his stomach, and the comfort of sleeping indoors without a rifle in his hands. He stabled the animal at Farron's and stepped into the warmth of Miss Bell's boarding house, where supper still lingered in the air and firelight licked the walls like it missed them. That's when she arrived. No warning, no fanfare, just the thud of boot heels on wet boards, the door thrown wide, and the wind rushing in like it had business there. She was soaked through, wrapped in a threadbare shawl that might have once been blue. Mud clung to her hem and blood darkened one sleeve. Her eyes were the sharp color of green glass in river shallows, and every soul in the room felt them land on Eli like a weight. "Looking for a man," she said, voice raw from cold and more miles than any map could hold. "They said he's here." "What kind of man?" Miss Bell asked, rising behind the counter with a mother hen's caution. The whole room had gone still. "Kind who owes me nothing but might not turn me out," she said. "Name's Cade." Eli didn't move for a moment, just stared at her through the wavering heat of the stove, his hands loose at his sides. She looked half-starved, half-hunted, trouble wearing a woman's skin and something else he didn't recognize right away, something almost like hope, scraped raw. "I'm Cade," he said finally. She looked at him like it cost her something to believe it. Then she nodded and stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind her like a coffin lid. No one asked more questions, not yet. Miss Bell got her a blanket, a dry dress, hot stew. Eli stood back and watched her peel off the rain in layers, saw the bruises under the dirt, the way her fingers trembled when they curled around a spoon. She didn't say much after that, just ate, then slept, curled like a wounded bird on the edge of the bed in the upstairs room they gave her. He didn't sleep that night, sat on the porch with a pipe that never lit, listening to the wind try to tear the world apart. Her name was Ruth. She told him that the next morning, over black coffee and a silence heavy enough to crack stone. No last name, no story offered, just Ruth. He didn't press. He figured it would come. The days passed with a kind of uneasy rhythm. She kept to herself, helped Miss Bell in the kitchen, took long walks through the brittle winter fields with a scarf pulled tight against her chin. He'd see her sometimes, standing still at the edge of the pasture, eyes on the hills like they held something she'd lost, or feared might find her. He knew that look, had worn it once. They didn't speak much, not at first, just shared the same rooms, the same quiet. But in the way she poured his coffee, or the way he left a coat hanging by the door for her, a shape began to take hold. Not trust, not yet, but something that might lean that way if given time and warmth. It was Miss Bell who said it plain, one evening by the fire when Ruth had gone upstairs, and the wind was pressing its cold mouth against the windows. "She's run from something," she said, "and I reckon it's not done chasing." Eli didn't answer, just stared into the flames like they might explain anything. "She's brought trouble with her, you know that." "I know." Miss Bell studied him for a moment, then nodded, "but maybe she's brought something else, too." He said nothing, but that night, as he watched the snow come down thick and unyielding, he found himself remembering prayers he hadn't let cross his lips in years. Not since the fires, not since the dead stopped answering back. He hadn't been asking for redemption, hadn't asked for anything in a long time. But here she was, and something was coming with her. He could feel it in his bones. And he knew deep as marrow that whatever it was, this was only the beginning. The thaw came late that year. By mid-March, the snow had begun to rot, peeling back in clumps from the scrub and revealing earth that was hard as old leather beneath. Streams ran gray with melt. The sky stretched wider each day, but the cold still crept in at night like a dog not ready to give up its bone. Ruth had begun to move differently, less like a ghost, more like a woman with calluses and reasons. She swept the porch without being asked, mended a loose shutter with wire and grit, brought home eggs in her apron from the coop behind the church. Her hair, darker now with rest and washing, caught the light sometimes in a way that made Eli forget the world entirely for half a second at a time. But he never let the forgetting last. The truth was a shadow always waiting at the corner of her mouth. Something unsaid pressed in every time their eyes met too long, every time her hands stilled in the dishwater like they remembered what it was to bleed. One morning early, he found her in the barn. Not hiding, not praying, just sitting quiet beside his old mare, brushing out her winter coat in long, slow strokes. "She had a name?" she asked without turning. "She did, Junie." "That's short for something." "Juniper." Ruth made a soft noise of approval. "Strong name, she's got an old soul." Eli leaned on the doorframe, arms crossed, like recognizes like. She didn't smile, but her mouth tilted as if it might have once, long ago. "You ever been to New Mexico territory?" He shook his head, rode near it once. She nodded. "I came from there, the dry part near Silver City. There was a man with a lawman's badge and a drunkard's hands. I married him because I was too scared not to." That was all she said. No names, no stories, just that, like setting a stone on a grave. Eli didn't ask more. He walked to the feed bin, poured oats into the trough, and let the silence settle like dust. She stayed a while longer, then left without a word, but something in her shoulders looked easier. That night, a man came to Mercy Creek. He rode a gelding with sweat lathered thick on its neck and wore a coat too fine for the kind of weather still biting through the land. He didn't go to the saloon, didn't knock at the marshal's, just stood in the middle of Main Street like he expected someone to come meet him. Eli watched from the shadows of the livery, hand resting on the worn grip of a revolver he hadn't touched in 6 months. The man asked questions, calm at first, then less so. No one answered much. Townsfolk had learned to mind their own business long before Ruth came, and even more so after. It wasn't until the 3rd day that he found her. It happened outside the mercantile. Ruth was carrying a sack of flour when the man stepped out from the alley and said her name like he owned it. "Ruth Delaney." She froze just for a breath, then turned slow. "William," she said, no fear, no greeting, just a name as cold and final as iron. He smiled like a man seeing a pawn right where he left it. "Didn't figure you'd get far." "I didn't try to." "You're coming with me." "No." His smile cracked just a hair. That wasn't a question. By then, Eli had crossed the street. No rush, no noise, just steady boots and something in his eyes that made the few witnesses back away from windows. "She said no," Eli said. William turned. He was younger than Eli by a few years, but softer around the edges. The kind of man who'd only bled from things that couldn't fight back. "And you are." "Doesn't matter." William looked between them, calculation turning in his gaze. "She's my wife." "She was," Ruth said. "Not anymore." "You run from a man like me, Ruth. You run out of country to hide in." "I ain't hiding, I'm surviving." Eli stepped forward, slow. "Best you ride on, mister." William's hand twitched toward his coat. And that was when Eli moved. It wasn't loud. One shot clean. William staggered back, gun clattering across the boards. The bullet had taken him in the shoulder, enough to end the argument without making a martyr. Ruth didn't flinch, just stared at the man bleeding on the street like she'd seen worse, and she had. But she reached for Eli's arm as they turned, grounding herself. They left him to the doctor. The law would come for him soon enough. Ruth didn't ask what would happen next. She just stood on the porch that night and watched the sun go down behind the hills, fire painting the sky like blood run backward. "You didn't have to shoot him," she said finally. "I did." "You always carry a gun." "Not for most things." "And for me." Eli looked at her, long and quiet. "I carried it for what might follow you, figured I'd know when to use it." She turned away, the wind catching her hair. "I brought you nothing but trouble," she said. He stepped up beside her, the boards creaking beneath their weight. "Maybe," he said, "but you also brought something else." She didn't ask what, not yet. But she leaned into the silence between them like it might hold her up if she let it. And for now, that was enough. Spring settled in like a breath let out slow. The hills turned from brittle gold to green, and the cottonwoods along the creek unfurled their leaves like hands waking from a long sleep. Calves wobbled new-legged through pasture mud, and the sun hung higher, warmer, touching things that hadn't known light in months. The town spoke less of the man who came and more of the woman who stayed. William Delaney had been taken east by rail, cuffed and cowed by the U.S. Marshal out of Abilene. Charges of desertion, theft, and mistreatment caught up quicker than Eli ever expected. Folks in Mercy Creek, never ones to meddle, saw Ruth now as someone who'd walked through fire and hadn't burned all the way through. Eli didn't speak of it again, and Ruth didn't offer, but something shifted between them after that day. She rode with him now, sometimes to the high pasture, sometimes just to ride. He showed her how to brace her knees on the saddle, how to speak to a horse with more than reins. She was a quick learner, quiet and watchful, hands strong from labor and soft with creatures. One afternoon, they paused beneath a bluff where wildflowers had begun to bloom in the shelter of stone. She dismounted slow, gazing out at the valley below, the river threading through it like silver caught in a fold of land. "I used to dream about places like this," she said. "Places where no one knew my name, and I didn't owe anyone a damn thing." "You reckon you found it?" he asked. She thought on that. Maybe, but dreams are always prettier in the dark. Eli crouched, plucking a sprig of purple sage from the edge of the trail. "Real things are quieter. They ask more of you. And give less back. Sometimes they give exactly what you need." She turned to him then, the wind catching strands of her hair, eyes narrowed not in doubt, but in the ache of something half-believed. "You always talk like that?" she asked. He gave a half-shrug. "Only when I've got nothing better." She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. There were moments after that, small things, sharp as flint and just as lasting. A shared biscuit by a campfire, her hand brushing his as they passed tools. The way she laughed once, low and unexpected, when a goat chased her through the barn like it had a score to settle. But there were shadows, too. Eli noticed her waking early, long before light, hands curled in the blanket like she was holding off something that wouldn't stay gone. He saw the way she stiffened at raised voices, the way her gaze darted toward exits, always counting. And one night, he heard her cry. It was quiet, muffled against a pillow, but he heard it all the same. Didn't go to her. Just sat in the kitchen until morning, fire burning low, coffee untouched. The next day she didn't speak of it, but she stood closer when they walked the trail, and he let that be enough. Then came the fire. It started 2 ridges north, lightning catching dry grass where spring rains hadn't yet reached. The wind carried it hard and fast, smoke rising black against the twilight sky. Eli smelled it before he saw it, the acrid warning pulling him upright in the saddle like a wire yanked tight. They rode through the night, warning neighbors, herding stock. Ruth didn't falter once, not when ash began to fall, not when flames showed red on the horizon. She carried children in her arms, led horses through smoke, tore her dress on barbed wire and kept going. At dawn the fire broke. Wind turned, Mercy found them. Homes were lost, but lives weren't. When they stumbled back into Mercy Creek, soot-streaked and bone-tired, Ruth sat down on the steps of the church and put her head in her hands. Eli sat beside her, said nothing. After a long while, she spoke. "Wasn't sure I'd make it through another one." "You did." "Not because I'm strong." "No," he said, "because you didn't quit." She looked at him then, really looked. Her eyes were rimmed red, face drawn, but there was something else there too, something building. "You said I brought something else," she whispered, "that day in the street." "I did." She waited. "You brought back a piece of me I thought was dead," he said. "That's no small thing." She blinked, the words hitting soft but deep. Her voice broke when she asked, "You sure it's not just pity?" Eli shook his head slow. "Pity's what you give a man with no legs and no fight left. What I've got for you is steadier than that." She leaned against him. Finally, the side of her body resting against his like she'd been walking miles to find this exact shape. Outside, the land was still blackened. The air still held the ghost of smoke. But in that small space between them, something like green was starting to grow. The fire left scars across the land, black threads where grass should be, ash clinging to the crevices of stone like old guilt. But the soil beneath it remembered. And when the rains finally came in April, they came hard, drumming the rooftops like a second heartbeat and coaxing green from every charred edge. What burned would bloom again. So would she. Ruth changed in those weeks. Not suddenly, but like a river carving rock, patient, inevitable. She stood taller now when she moved through town, looked people in the eye, wore her sleeves rolled up, and her hair braided low like a woman who meant to stay. Miss Bell taught her how to sew strong hems and measure salt by feel. The preacher's wife gave her a cutting from her rosebush, and Ruth planted it behind the boarding house, fingers deep in wet earth. She didn't speak of what came before, not anymore. But she smiled more often, and when she laughed, it didn't sound borrowed. Eli noticed it all, every shift, every piece of armor she laid down without ceremony. He didn't name it, just made space for it, rebuilt the fence along her garden, left small things where she'd find them, a worn book, a comb with mother-of-pearl teeth, a tin cup polished to shine, not gifts, just offerings. She took to leaving him notes. Just a few words, tucked into his coat pocket or beneath his plate. I patched the tear in your shirt. Ride safe. You were right about the weather. He saved them all. By late May, the town was planning its Founders' Day celebration. Bunting and pies, fiddle reels in the square. Mercy Creek wasn't much for pomp, but it had survived another hard season, and that was worth the telling. Ruth stood beside Eli the night of the dance. She wore a dress the color of new leaves and boots she'd scrubbed until the leather gleamed. The townsfolk welcomed her like she'd always belonged. The sheriff tipped his hat. The blacksmith's boy asked for a dance. She obliged, cheeks flushed and laughter light in her throat. Eli watched from the edge of the square, hands in his pockets, heart tight with something too quiet to name. When she returned, she looked up at him and said, "Why didn't you ask?" He shrugged, didn't think I had a right to. You don't need a right, just a reason. He held out his hand. She took it. They danced in the dust beneath the stars, slow and sure. No spectacle, just movement and breath and the heat of her palm against his. Later, walking back through the darkened town, she stopped near the church steps. The moon hung high, washing the world in silver. She turned to him, eyes unreadable. There's something I haven't told you. Eli felt the shift in her tone. Quiet, serious, he waited. I had a child, she said. A son, he's gone. The words landed like snow on an empty field. No sound, just weight. He was born small, she went on, voice steady but far off. Weak lungs. He didn't make it to his second spring. Eli didn't speak, just reached for her hand, fingers curling slow around hers. I stopped praying after that, she whispered. Stopped believing there was anything worth asking for. He understood that, deeper than he could say. I carried that grief like a stone in my chest, she said. Still do some days. You don't have to carry it alone. She looked at him then, truly looked, like the first time he'd said her name out loud. I don't know what this is between us, she said, but I know it's real. It's not rescue, Eli said. No, she agreed, it's something steadier. And in that moment, with the smell of lilacs on the wind and the whole town asleep around them, she leaned in and kissed him. Not desperate, not rushed. Just quiet and certain, like two people choosing each other with their eyes wide open. When they pulled apart, she didn't speak, just rested her forehead against his and breathed. He held her there, still and steady, the night wrapping around them like a quilt stitched from everything they'd survived. Trouble had come with her. But so had something else. And it was only just beginning. Summer opened slow, warm, and forgiving. The air turned heavy with sage and sun, the river ran low and golden, and the hills held the long hum of crickets through dusk. Mercy Creek settled into the season like a dog curling up beside a fire, cautious still, but trusting the peace to hold a while longer. Ruth and Eli moved through it together, not loudly, not like a thing announced, but like water finding its course beside stone. She took over the baking at Miss Bell's, started selling loaves to the mercantile. He taught her how to read the sky for storms, how to know by scent when a horse was sick, how to carry a wound without letting it fester. They lived beside each other, not tangled, but twined, the way two trees grow when they've weathered the same winds. Sometimes she'd wake early, step barefoot onto the porch, and watch the light stretch over the field. He'd join her without speaking, hand her a tin cup of coffee, and together they'd watch the world turn soft again. But the past does not give up its dead easily. It came on a Tuesday, in the shape of a letter. No stamp, no return, just a name written in a sharp, practiced hand, Ruth Delaney Cade. She read it on the porch. He watched her eyes narrow, mouth go still. "You want to read it aloud?" he asked. She shook her head, then folded it once neat and set it down. "His brother," she said finally, "William, says he's coming, says he aims to make things right." Eli didn't ask what that meant, just leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You afraid?" She thought about it, not of him, not anymore. "But I'm afraid of being pulled back, of who I was then, what I let happen." "You're not her anymore." She looked at him, brow creased. "Ain't that simple?" "No," he said, "it's not, but you get to choose now, that's the difference." The man came 3 days later. Tall, well-dressed, more lawyer than outlaw. He brought no threats, no weapons, just words and a look that said he knew more than he ought, claimed to want peace, said the Delaney family wanted nothing further but closure, perhaps forgiveness. Ruth stood on the edge of the road with Eli beside her and said, "I've forgiven what I can. What I can't, I'll carry." The man looked at her long, then nodded. "If you ever change your mind." "I won't," she said, voice calm as water in a deep well. He left without further talk. That night Eli found her in the garden, fingers in the soil, pulling weeds like penance. "He looked like him," she said, "not in the face, in the way he tried to make my story smaller, neater, like it could fit in a ledger." Eli knelt beside her. "You don't owe them anything." "I know," she looked down at her hands, "but it still shakes something loose, like my bones remember being afraid." He took her hand then, dirt and all, held it like a vow. "You're not alone," he said. She looked at him, and this time she didn't look away. Later, when the sky burned orange and the crickets sang louder than thought, they sat together on the porch and talked. Not of pain, not of what was taken, but of what might be built now that the earth was finally quiet. "We could take that plot west of the ridge," Eli said. "Build a house there, close to the river, plenty of good soil." Ruth sipped her coffee. "If you want it," he said. She didn't answer right away, just reached down, pulled off her boots, and set her feet bare against the warm wood. "I think I'd like that," she said. A pause, then, softer. "I'd like to grow something from scratch, something that doesn't hurt." He nodded slow. "Then we will." And in that silence, the kind that only comes after long storms and longer survival, she leaned into him. Not as a woman in need of saving. Not as someone with debts. But as someone choosing. And in the still heat of a summer evening, with the scent of sage in the air and the memory of fire far behind, Eli understood what she'd brought with her that no one else ever had. Not just trouble, but the one thing he'd stopped believing he could have. A reason to begin again.